Alright guys, in this video we're going to cover unemployment. To define unemployment, you first got to start with what is employment. Straightforward. Employment is when a person has done any work for pay or profit during a year. Of course, that could be during any time period, but most of the time when we hear unemployment figures, when we're talking about the year time frame. Okay, so then what is unemployment? Unemployment is a person is unemployed if they do not have a job but are available for work and have been actively seeking work for the previous 4 weeks. Okay, so why is the definition of unemployment sort of so long when the definition of unemployment is so short, right? Employment as a definition, nice and tidy, right? It's like if you've worked, you've done these things, you're employed during that time period. Unemployment's a little trickier, right? Because there are some people that don't have a job, but they're not looking for a job. So they're not unemployed, right? They're not available for work, they're not looking for work, then they're not really unemployed. They're not employed, but they're not unemployed. Okay? So what's the labor force? The labor force then is the total number of employed or unemployed people. So it's people that have jobs and people that are looking for jobs. Is that exactly everyone in the population? Well, no. Retired people, stay-at-home mothers, people that are not looking for jobs for whatever, I don't know, independently wealthy or something like this. They're not looking for jobs, and so they're not employed, but neither are they unemployed, right? So labor force is just sort of the total potential people in your economy that are working and or want to be working. Okay, so the government tracks employment, and it does this through household and establishment surveys. They send out surveys to track this, so it's imprecisely measured. It's not like we have these exactly perfect records. We generally think they do a good enough job to report these numbers and use them in economic research and whatnot. Okay, so given that there's this definition of unemployment, we then can have some ideas that kind of help us categorize different potential labor force participants. Okay, so to be counted as unemployed, you have to be searching, but there are some people who were searching but have recently stopped searching. They're not unemployed. We call these discouraged workers. Okay, so people were looking for a job and they gave up, so they're not technically unemployed, right? But they're sort of close to being part of the labor force. Another idea here is what we call marginally attached workers. So those who have looked for work in the last 12 months but not in the last 4 weeks. So they were unemployed. They've given up, but they've given up sort of recently. Okay, so discouraged workers, marginally attached workers. Another idea we have is underemployed workers. So when you have a job, but this job doesn't take full advantage of their education, skills, or experience, right? So for whatever reason, I have a highly educated, experienced lawyer, and they can't find a job working at a law firm. Maybe the economy is really bad at the moment, and they end up taking some kind of job that doesn't really fully take into account all of their skills. Now, sometimes, right, this is not people who have skills that are, outdated or something. It's something about the labor market is not allowing those people to match with the job that would really take advantage of their skills, and their skills are relevant and currently valued in markets. It's just they're not able to find a job that's doing that. Okay. A fun idea from labor economics that I think is interesting to mention here is this idea of an efficiency wage. And that's when an employer pays more than they have to get a worker in order to encourage the worker to stay with the company, work harder, better teams, etc. Some really interesting examples of this are like oil producing firms, right? So some firms, they try to hire good engineers. Other firms pay about 10% more than what their competitors pay in order to attract engineers, and then they sort of have a real high standard for productivity. They typically kind of get to pick who they want out of the market, right? So they say we kind of get the best whatever X% of engineers out of the market every year. But then they have a little quicker turnover. They're more quick to fire people. They have higher performance standards because they're paying this efficiency wage. Other firms might engage in efficiency wage but not have the same sort of quick hiring and firing practices. They might hire people at these increased wages, and then now they don't have to worry about losing people because where are their employees going to go if they're already making more than the market rate? They might be really grateful for their jobs. They might go above and beyond at that firm compared to other places, and lots of realistic mechanisms there. Okay, so there are 3 types of unemployment. The first is frictional, and this is when a person is just between jobs voluntarily. All right, they've got a job, they haven't started the next one, they're technically unemployed for that time period. Frictional unemployment is just really not something that we spend a lot of time worrying about. The next is structural unemployment, and that is unemployment caused by the structure of consumer demands or technology in production. Okay, so if we have an economy that's switching from horse and buggy over to motorized vehicles, right, then the people that are doing those tasks technologically related to the horse and buggy, they might find themselves unemployed, and that's not going to be frictional unemployment, that's going to be structural unemployment. Okay, we see lots of that today with the way that moving more and more towards computer related skills, online things like this. So you might sort of be pushed out of a market if your skills don't match with the way that your particular industry is going. Maybe it's not a technological thing, it's just consumers have preferences that change from sort of preferring one product to another. So skills that are related to producing the first product are going to be in lower demand. Those people might become unemployed. We hear lots of structural unemployment for policy discussion, right? So lots of administrations say, we've got this unemployment problem, we're going to train people in computers that's going to fix structural unemployment. Of course, as a general comment on that as a policy, I think it's got the right idea. We need to fix structural unemployment. You don't want to be trying to target frictional unemployment. It's generally not a very good strategy because government agencies don't know what's in demand in markets, and they don't know how many people to be putting into those skills. So you're better off leaving that kind of thing alone, or providing sort of very general support rather than very specific support. Okay, the last is cyclical unemployment, and this is when unemployment's not frictional, it's not people between jobs, it's not structural, it's not like there's some fundamental change in the economy, right? It's actually that you've got unemployment that's caused by a business cycle. So there's nothing wrong with the particular, it's just that there's a recession, businesses are on hard times, they gotta, in order to try to make it, they gotta let people go, they lay people off. So that's cyclical unemployment. Okay, so full employment is not zero, right? One of the things that sometimes we see as a mistake is people are like, oh, we're not at full employment because there's non-zero unemployment. The problem is there's always going to be some frictional and some structural unemployment. People are going to be moving between jobs in a good, healthy economy. There's going to be structural unemployment because the economy should be growing and developing new technologies, new products. Some businesses are going to be winning, some businesses are going to be losing. This is all good. Full employment is when there's zero cyclical unemployment. So there aren't recessions that are causing unemployment. Okay, a similarly related idea is this natural rate of unemployment. So that includes your frictional and structural, but not your cyclical unemployment. Okay, so this is kind of a technical definition, bear with me, I'll explain it. This is when price and wage decisions are consistent. Okay, so there is some level of, employment and inflation are, they're related. How exactly that happens is not totally clear, and there are different models. We'll get into the models of the macroeconomies next after we go through this measurement period, and those models will have different theories as to how employment and inflation are related, right? But when prices are conveying to the market the reality of the situation, so there's not this inflation, then the choices that people make in consumption and the choices that people make in hiring employees are based on true information, price, and wage signals. Remember what we said prices do. Prices convey information from consumers to producers and from producers to consumers. When those things are consistent, they're accurate, they're not being distorted by inflation, then we will have the natural rate of unemployment, because cyclical unemployment should be zero. Okay, So there's several things that the government tries to do related to unemployment. One of these is unemployment insurance. This is just straightforward payments to the unemployed. If you become unemployed, the government gives you some money to try to help make ends meet. There are potential good things about this policy. So job match quality should, in theory, go up. And there's some studies that show that it does. It's just hard to get the exact amount of unemployment benefits and length of unemployment benefits. Difficult to make those really match up to what people need. So what's job match quality? Job match quality is the goodness of fit between an employee and their position. All right, so if I got an astronaut doing brain surgery, that's going to be a poor job match quality, right? If I have a astronaut going up in space, good job match quality. Of course, that's really crude, broad distinction there, but obviously there's just all kind of different factors. You can have people that have different skill sets that are better or worse fits just based on their individual skills, even though their broad skills look like they match, and so on. Okay. The other benefit there is safety net. This is a thing that people probably principally think about when they think about unemployment insurance, right? Is it allows people that don't have an appropriate level of savings and get hit really hard by the job market to help make ends meet. This, of course, is a double-edged sword, right? So I'll put a little like asterisk here on that. Right, this is a double-edged sword because if you provide that safety net, then people won't provide their own safety nets. They'll go on to eventually need more help in that term. So it's sort of a double-edged sword there. It's good to help people, but it's bad to discourage people from helping provide their own safety net. Okay, naturally there are costs as well, and the main thing is that there's decreased incentive to take a job. If I'm getting unemployment benefits, I'm getting paid to do nothing. When a job comes along, it's not the perfect fit, so I think, okay, well, I'm going to wait for a better job match, higher pay, job that I like more. I'll have less incentive to take that job. I'll stay unemployed longer, which of course is obviously bad for me and bad for the economy. Okay, let's take some examples here. Another one that we think is a government policy directed at unemployment is minimum wage. This turns out to be a very bad idea, but before I want to set anytime I talk about minimum wage, I always want to set the context for us. And by that, I just want to ask, what percentage do you think of all the workers in the U.S. are at minimum wage, make minimum wage or less? Okay, so pause the video here, take a look. Do you think it's 5%, 15%, 25%, 40 to 60%? Okay, now that you're back, I tricked you. It's 0.5% of all wage earners. 0.5% of all wage earners. Okay, wage earners are about, it's 1% of wage earners. 1% of wage earners, which is about 0.5% in total because wage earners are half of all workers. Okay, wage earners, half of all workers. So 0.5% of people. Right, so anytime we're talking about minimum wage, just keep in mind you're not talking about this huge fraction of people in an economy, right? So we're just not talking about that many people. Okay, but let's do an analysis, right? So let's take a look at the market for labor. Okay, so what's supplied? Hours worked. Okay, so the problem with the labor market is you could think supply in this case is households. It's people deciding to work. What's demand? Demand, this is the employer. Okay, so the employer is the one that's out there looking to hire people to work. They're demanding labor, and the people providing the labor are the people that are doing the work, and they're providing hours of labor. Okay, so let's look at this market. There's, of course, straightforward market analysis. We'll get a certain quantity of hours provided at a certain wage. Now we install a minimum wage. What happens? Well, if we remember, right, minimum wage is a floor, can't go below that. It holds things up, right? So the gravity want to pull that down, and so we've got minimum wage now. So what's the effect of minimum wage? Well, if the wage is higher, the amount that suppliers want to supply is higher. People want to work more if the wage is higher. There's a natural effect, though. If the wage is higher, the amount that consumers will want, in this case employers, will be much lower at this minimum wage, right? So we, of course, know what this effect is called already, right? This is what we call a surplus. This is what we call a surplus. Now, the important part of this analysis here, which we probably didn't cover in especially great detail when we went through ceilings and floors earlier, is what if we actually have this minimum wage, what will be the actual outcome? So when we have this market clearing wage, we know that quantity H there, the amount of hours produced, will match because the market will clear. Now the market's not going to clear, and so people want to provide this many hours, but firms want to purchase this many hours. What will happen? Well, it's only the case that the overlapping amount of hours demanded and hours supplied is actually going to be the amount of hours that get worked and compensated. That'll be this number, right? That'll be this lower number, right? So the market will actually clear here, right? So it's not that, oh, look, there's all these people that want to work, and so somehow they'll get jobs. No, this entire surplus here will be people that end up wanting to work that don't work, okay? We have a name for that. That's unemployment, when you want to work but you don't work. So who gets hurt? Well, it's a little hard to say, actually, when you stop and think about it, because some workers, there's sort of two groups here. Group one is workers that do get to work at higher wages, right? So up to QD, those people work and they make a higher wage, right? Because they were going to make this wage. Now they make this wage. Workers at higher wages actually get helped. But, of course, there's a second group, workers that don't work at all. Who are these people? These are all the people between quantity demanded and the quantity supplied in this case. Those people are then unemployed. So what's happening here is minimum wage is creating this trade-off where the people that keep their jobs get paid higher, the people that don't get jobs are unemployed. And there's a certain amount of people between the quantity demanded and the equilibrium quantity, QH there in that first scenario, that were employed at a lower wage but now are unemployed. Okay, so we're transferring all the gains between QD and QH to QD in the terms of higher wages. Okay, what happens, hypothetically here, if we raise minimum wage? Well, as you can immediately see, there'll be even more people and even fewer hours demanded. Okay, so the amount of unemployment would go up. The amount that the people in Camp 1 would benefit would rise. Those people will get more, but there would be even fewer of them. And the number of people that are in Group 2 would go up. Okay, so what does minimum wage do? It funnels compensation from people that would have been employed to people that managed to retain their jobs. Okay, this probably has bad consequences for inequality, which is sort of odd, that people would champion minimum wage as like something that helps the little guy, because it's actually going to hurt the people that most need it, right? So imagine a scenario, you got two people competing for a minimum wage job now that minimum wage has been raised, right? And you have a, sort of down in their luck ex-convict versus, the local valedictorian at the high school. They both want to work at McDonald's, make some money. They got to build their resume and their skill set and just make ends meet, right? Who's getting the job in the second scenario now that wages have gone up? Of course, it'll be the high school valedictorian. So you're actually going to increase inequality as employers who have to pay higher wages and therefore want to hire fewer people will then begin to sort on things that they weren't sorting on before. And that's going to be largely things that we probably don't want them sorting on for minimum wage jobs. Okay. The question that I want to turn to now is this idea of wage stagnation. So you're going to hear this argument, and I'll lay this out here in a minute with a particular case study presented by the Economic Policy Institute. There's this prevailing narrative out there that wages have stagnated. Have wages stagnated in recent years as the economy begins to sort of not increase wages at the way that it used to? Now, I think there are good answers to this because there actually is some evidence for stagnation. But I just want to answer this question broadly. Have wages stagnated? Well, here you go from 1965 into 2021 or 22. The average hourly earnings of production and non-supervisory employees, okay, so I'm saying here's everybody that's working that's not a manager, their wages very steadily rise, and in fact, 2020 we actually see a short spike, and then, you know, the downturn there's really just a reversion to the mean. We see this increase. Not much evidence that wages have stagnated. Okay, now you might say, okay, that's average hourly earnings. What about like median household income? And it's got this sort of bumpy path, but the general trend is one of increase, and it has a predictable, right, it falls when we have these recessions, these gray lines are recessions. It bottoms out shortly thereafter and then goes back to climbing. So we have the cyclicality of real median household income. Now, household income is probably the most important measure because those are the units that actually make economic decisions, more important than the individual, for example. But household income is also subject to the measure of how many people in this household are working, right? So the median household income might go down if we have more households because more households separate. It might go up if more women choose to work, and so the number of people working in the household, okay, is that a good way to measure income? It really is, but it just has these other things that we have to keep in mind. Hence the smoothness in average earnings and sort of the choppiness in household income. Okay, a couple more. So real median household income in the United States here in recent years, we saw this big drop from the 2008 recession and then this big climb back into the late 2010s. Now, another way we can think about this is hourly compensation. So not just earnings, but everything that people are making. And we're going to sort of factor out the farm sector. So these sort of maybe higher proportion of white-collar jobs. We see this real straight trend. Again, little blip here in 2020. But over the years, straightforward trend and increase. So we don't see much stagnation. Maybe there's a little stagnation right here. Again, that looks like to be caused by 2008, and then it goes back to increasing in later years. Now, here's some evidence that there actually is some stagnation, right? Here's some evidence that there's stagnation. If we don't account for inflation, we see current wages. Notice that I'm doing hourly wages here. They look like they're going up pretty good. But if we look from 64 to 2018 in inflation adjusted real purchasing power, was a very slight increase. Now that looks like stagnation, okay? So generally not a whole lot of evidence for stagnation, but we've got these kind of very interesting, very particular hourly wages evidence that there is stagnation. Okay. The problem with that, of course, is that's wages and salaries. It looks really, really flat. But if we look at total benefits, so things that are going to be in here, overtime payment, paid leave, insurance premium, retirement contributions, benefits, etc., we actually see a much, much higher rate of increase here. Okay, so it looks like people are getting compensated, and it's increasing over time, but it's just that it's not all in money, right? In what we call pecuniary compensation. Okay, so let's take a look at the particular, probably one of the best formulations of the wage stagnation theory, right? Okay, so we got this decades and decades following the World War II where inflation-adjusted hourly compensation goes up straightforward with productivity, okay? And this is the important part. I'm going to talk about it here in a minute, but economic theory predicts that wages will follow productivity. So productivity is increasing, wages should go up with it. Okay. However, the study shows since 73, the hourly compensation of American workers has not risen in line with economic-wide productivity. That's their conjecture, and this hourly compensation has stopped rising basically at all. That's that graph that I showed you right here. That's this guy. Okay, and they say since 73, so right about there, right? So they're measuring from here because, right, some of that increase looks like it happens quickly in 64. Notice that there still is some increase, but we definitely call that stagnation if they're right about that, okay? So they're saying net productivity grew over 1% every year, right? So notice that's every year, not in total, right? And you've got this really tiny 0.2% annual rise in median hourly compensation, right? And so basically the upshot of the argument is you've got rising productivity in recent decades, so there has this potential for growth, and it should pay out to a vast majority of workers, and we're getting this rising inequality, putting a wedge between potential and actual growth, okay? So they say economic evidence indicates the rising gap between productivity and pay has nothing to do with stagnation in typical workers' individual productivity, right? So maybe productivity is going up, but it's because there's a lot of superstars, and then the average worker really isn't getting any more productive. I don't think that's a good argument, but they're saying that's not what they're arguing either, okay? So I'm in agreement with them there. Okay, this is what they call decoupling. Did they say that actually here? Okay, they don't call it that. The field calls that decoupling. Okay, so this is the idea that wage growth is substantially lagging productivity growth. So the question is, are wages decoupling from production? Okay, so economic theory is very straightforward. Labor is paid its marginal product. This is one of those things that is really, really confusing to non-economists, right? A good example of this is, let's take a different price that's not wages. Why is water so much more important than diamonds, but diamonds cost so much more than water? Well, the answer is prices are determined on the margin. There's lots and lots and lots of water. There's, of course, high demand for water. So the margin that determines the price, because supply is so high, is very low, right? Diamonds, on the other hand, whether artificial or not, right? Diamond market it has a lot of ethical issues related to the supply of it, right? Artificially or not, the end result is that supply is relatively low compared to demand, and so that determines the price, and so the price therefore is really, really high. Now, a quick way to prove this intuitively is imagine a world where the amount of diamonds stays exactly the same, but we end up in this post-apocalyptic, nuclear fallout has ruined a bunch of our water sources, right? And now water is really, really scarce. What's going to happen to the price of water? It'll shoot through the roof because of the scarcity, right? So that's kind of a way to understand the average value of something is not what determines its price. It's the margin, right? It's actually determined on the margin. Labor is the same way. Right? So you say, oh, we couldn't field a basketball team if we didn't have all these other players. Why does LeBron James get paid so much, right? Well, it's because his marginal value is much, much higher to his particular firm, team, and industry, right? So remember that labor is paid its marginal product, and your marginal product in this case is determined by a lot of things, right? You can have the most talented person in the world. If they don't have access to the right tools or instruments of their trade, is very low. So your marginal product is dependent on the context that it happens in. Okay, so let's take a look here at a good study that examines the growing gap between real wages and productivity. So here's that wedge that they described earlier, right? Here's gross output. Oh man, productivity going up. Look at this. Production of workers corrected for inflation is really flat, right? So we look at gross output per hour. Look at this. It's going up. Compensation, it's going up, but it's really flat, right? Production workers is even worse. Hourly workers, of course, kind of in between. Now, there's some counterpoints to that, right? Which this is the important part, right? So labor's this line's really confusing, actually. So let's look at the other two lines really quickly. Net output per hour going up. Real compensation. So what's the difference? Hourly compensation, hourly wages, real product compensation. So when you count for everything, not just hourly wages, suddenly these two guys are not very far apart, right? Now, what's this line mean, right? Because I was showing you this graph to say, oh man, production worker hourly wages, really flat. This line looks like that. It's even worse that it's blue, right? But that's not. It's labor compensation share in net income. So how much of the net income goes to compensating labor? Notice that it's really close to 100, right? So it's just under 100. So it's like 90 some odd % of the total income in a company is going to paying labor. So the fact that this line is flat is really good. If it were falling, it would say, look, labor is getting a smaller and smaller share. Okay, so a little bit confusing. Just kind of keep that in your mind. Okay, so now here's a paper that takes on decoupling exactly, right? So we got these different surveys that they're using. We've got the National Income Survey, and we got the consumer, I forgot the word. The CPS survey is one of the biggest, most important surveys that we have in economics, and why the name of it is escaping me at the moment, I don't know. But, okay, so let's look at what we're looking at here. Employees' mean compensation, annual wage, mean annual earnings, and mean annual earnings. They all kind of go up together. You can see the mean annual workings deflated by the GDP deflator is the one going up the fastest. This other survey, probably the one going up the slowest, but we see this general increase in wages. Wages don't look stagnant. Notice that this is only through 2010. Okay. Now, we need to add, right, everything else the same. Now we've just added labor productivity. Okay. So if we're looking at median hourly earnings, all of a sudden there's this big gap between the blue and the orange, right? But when we look at the mean hourly wage and we actually deflate these by the GDP deflator versus the CPI, right, we get a closing of that gap. Okay, so hourly decoupling. So let's take a look at the two there. Do we see decoupling? Well, labor productivity in GDP per hour is going up, almost mirroring it. Maybe there's a little separation starting here in 2000, and we see a very, very slight decoupling. Okay. Now, what matters, of course, is which inflation measure we use. CPI has this really high rate of inflation, whereas the PCE and GDP deflator show somewhat less inflation in this index during that base year. Okay. So what's the upshot then? The difference between median worker wages deflated by the CPI and productivity deflated by the GDP deflator really showed quite different results, right? Okay, so that 13% decrease actually is probably net decoupling, but that's the difference between the compensation and the labor productivity using common deflators. Okay, so if we measure, what we want to do is we want to measure labor productivity deflated by the CPI and compensation, which in this case, notice that we're still talking about hours, right? We're still talking about hours. So we're kind of saying, we'll stay on your turf, EPI. What are you getting? There is a growing wedge between compensation, right? So compensation is everything. Wages is just the income that you're getting, right? So you actually see a big part of the story is sort of being tricky here, saying let's deflate labor by GDP. Kind of makes sense, productivity, right? But let's deflate compensation by CPI. Makes sense, that's consumers. Except that when you do that, it creates this artificially large gap between the two things, and we actually see that when we use the same inflation deflator, which is what we should do, we want to compare apples to apples, most of that gap goes away. Okay, so there's two main errors here done by the EPI, and why I would say there's probably not a lot of case that wages are stagnating. A little bit. I don't want to pretend like this is one of those things where we can just say There's no case for wage stagnation. You're a crazy person if you believe in that. It's just dramatically overstated. And the reason for that is, first, EPI ignores compensation structure. So we've got lots of other benefits: health insurance, time off, pension, retirement, maternity leave, etc., that lower your total wage compensation but keep total compensation on pace with income. So for whatever reason, people and companies seem to be happier providing other types of benefits that aren't straight wages, and that's sort of muddying the story here. And when we account for that correctly, we see that the wage gap, the wedge, goes away. Okay. Second, if you use CPI on wages and GDP on productivity, then because CPI tends to overestimate inflation, as we saw in the last lecture, we get an artificially large gap, and we're comparing apples to oranges, and by doing that, we can sort of create a story that is a little bit dishonest. Okay, so wage stagnation, real, but probably very small.